All right, great. So, hello everyone. Welcome to another talk in our webinar series. This webinar is also being streamed live on YouTube, and you can find the link on our website. Today, we have Kartheik Iyer, a fellow at the University of Toronto, talking about timescales of galaxy evolution in simulations and observations. Kartheik, thank you very much for coming.
Uh, Thank you so much for having me here, and I hope everyone's doing well in these stressful times. I'm really happy to be talking about this work today. Uh, if you have any questions, please feel free to interrupt me during the talk and ask it, or type it into the chat, or ask me at the end, with whatever you're most comfortable with. So, um, I'm really, again, happy to be talking here. I'm a Dunlop postdoctoral fellow at the Dunlop Institute for Astronomy and Astrophysics at the University of Toronto. And this talk would not have been possible without all the help and advice of my collaborators listed above, and help from the collaborations that I'm a part of. In addition to this, one of the key results in this work comes from something called the Kavli Summer Program in Astrophysics, which is a summer-wide session where advisors and students from all over the world come together to work on specific topics. So for the grad students in the audience, I highly recommend this. So today I'm going to be talking about the timescales of the physical processes that cause galaxies to grow and quench. And I'm going to be talking about this from the viewpoint of simulations and observations. So there's going to be three parts to this talk. The first, where I introduce what timescales are and why they're important, and then move on to how we try to probe these using simulations and through observations. Right? So let's start with timescales. So we know that galaxies are massive, chaotic, turbulent structures that contain a large number of moving parts. And in addition to having a large number of moving parts, there's many different physical processes that affect how galaxies are able to grow, change their morphology, or quench, which is when they stop forming stars. So uh, there are many spatial and temporal scales over which these different processes act, and these processes are shown here with different colors showing different classes of processes. So on the smallest time scales, you have things that can locally affect whether or not giant molecular clouds are created and destroyed, and therefore how star formation happens on the smallest spatial and temporal time scales. And similarly, once you go to the largest time scales, you have processes that act galaxy wide, or sometimes their scope is even beyond the galaxy itself. And these processes usually act on very long time scales, and they can dramatically change how the galaxy looks and what its evolutionary state is. So if you think of a galaxy like a city, then the spatial scales are basically processes that happen on the scale of a single city block, or on the scale of a suburb, or on the scale of the full city. Similarly, the temporal scale is a process that's immediate, like say a blood donation drive that happens over a day, versus sweeping policy changes that take years and years to go across. So because there are all of these timescales, and because these timescale ranges are overlapping, it becomes really important for us to understand the relative importance of different physical processes for a population of galaxies, to figure out why they are acting in a certain way. So if a galaxy is forming stars, is it forming stars in a sort of steady mode, or is it bursty? If bursty, how bursty is it? Is it experiencing episodes of uh, quenching followed by rejuvenation? So there's many different populations of galaxies, and it's important for us to understand which processes dominate in each population to understand why galaxies grow in a certain way. The ranges of these timescales are broad not only because they act over that large range of timescales, which is true for some of these processes, but also because the studies that look at these processes haven't been able to narrow it down further, or if there are multiple studies that show you different results. For quenching, for example, quenching has been studied in different simulations, and these different simulations, while they broadly agree that galaxy quenching happens on long time scales, they haven't really been able to agree on the exact timescales on which the processes responsible for quenching are thought to act. And because of this, this ends up having a very large range. And even if we change the prescription in a simulation for changing the effect of any one of these processes, because there is an interplay between the processes, it might also change the timescales of other things. Okay, so this makes timescales a complicated, messy problem, but it's also a fun one, because now you get to understand the tie between why galaxies act a certain way and the underlying physical processes responsible for them from this completely unique point of view of the timescales, the characteristic timescales on which they're acting. Right. So just to summarize, on the largest timescales, we look at the processes that are responsible for growing and shutting down galaxies. On intermediate timescales, we understand how processes like feedback that are responsible for heating and cooling gas or for cycling gas in and out of galaxies are responsible for the diversity of galaxies that we see today. And on short timescales, we look at processes that are responsible for bursty or stochastic star formation. And we try to correlate it with the mechanisms that are responsible. And for all of these things, while this plot is only showing the estimates that come from simulations, we are approaching the point where we'll be able to observationally estimate a lot of these timescales as well. Right? So the key observable that I'm going to be talking about for most of this talk is going to be something called the star formation history of a galaxy. Now, the star formation history is a record of when a galaxy formed its stars. So it can be thought of as a graph of star formation rate versus time. And here I'm just showing you 3 example galaxies from the Simba simulation. And what you can see is that the star formation histories look quite different for all of these 3. And one of them's really old. It formed most of its stars quite close to the Big Bang at high redshifts, and then it's not been forming very much stars since. The orange one is more intermediate aged, and the green curve shows the star formation history of a galaxy that's still actively forming stars. So when people talk about the time scales in these, the one of the things people do is to try to measure the timescales directly from these star formation histories. And the way you can do this is either by doing things like fitting exponential profiles and then figuring out the declining timescale, or using a peak finder and then talking about the full width at half max, or by fitting other shapes like Gaussians and then looking at the overall width of the star formation history. And so these sort of summary statistics give you an estimate of what's going on in the galaxy and how long it's taking. Studies that do this are really important because by looking at the average behavior of star formation histories across cosmic time or across different stellar masses gives you an idea of how much time the physical processes that are dominant in these galaxies act for. But I'm going to be talking about a slightly different way of getting at timescales, and that's by using Fourier space. So since the time scale is correlated with frequency and Fourier space is built to handle problems involving frequencies, it's extremely well suited for this kind of analysis. And this means that, so if I have a sine wave that has a single time scale, so plots here show star formation rate versus time, and plots here show the same curve but represented in the Fourier domain. So I'm showing on the right the power spectral density, or PSD, as a function of fluctuation time scale. And so if there is a single time scale, then it shows up as a single peak in the PSD. And in the middle panel, I'm basically breaking down this into contributions from short, intermediate, and long time scales. And so you can see that there is no power on intermediate and long time scales, and there's only the short time scale oscillation. For slightly more complicated sine waves, where this is a sum of three different sine waves with three different time scales, you can see that, okay, now there is contributions from short, medium, and long time scales, and they sort of separate into these three different parts, and that there are peaks at all three time scales. And finally, for more complicated stochastic processes, where this one's for a random walk, you can see that the PSD does not look simple anymore. It's there are no prominent peaks. Rather, there is a overall slope using which this PSD can be represented. And so this slope shows that most of the power lies on the long time scale, followed by power on intermediate time scales, followed by power on the shortest time scales. And because the process is correlated, it means that the power on a certain time scale is also related to the power on other time scales by this slope. So here's an example applied to a real star formation history. So these are just mock curves where we already know the answer beforehand. But this is for, again, a single galaxy from the SIMBA simulation. The gray curve shows the star formation history, and the corresponding gray curve here shows the power spectral density. The black band shows the band pass. So I'm trying to isolate the contribution to the PSD from a single time scale or a single frequency. And you can see the effect of applying that band pass on the star formation history. It's just picking out the short time scale fluctuations. So if I now let this run, if I let the band pass vary, then what this is going to do is it's going to show you the contributions that come from all the different time scales. And the blue curve is going to show you what's happening when you add up all of these contributions. So as you integrate over the power spectrum and you add the contributions coming from all the different time scales, in the limit of time scale going to infinity, you recover the true star formation history. Right? So you're basically decomposing the star formation history into contributions that come from different time scales using the PSD. All right. So this is the initial timescale formalism. Are there any questions so far? All right. So if not, we'll continue to talking about how these timescales affect simulations, or how we can probe the timescales of different physical processes from simulations. So modern cosmological simulations that simulate galaxies and how they evolve have come a long way since n-body codes that used to be used to try to figure out why galaxies are forming disks and things like that. These days they are extremely large in scope. They're usually run on supercomputers, and they take many months to years to run. They come in many different flavors, from full magnetohydrodynamical codes that solve these equations to figure out what's happening from one time step to the next, to semi-analytical codes where you have physical prescriptions for how galaxies are going to act, and these physical prescriptions are applied to dark matter halo merger trees to create galaxies, to simulate how they would evolve without actually physically having to spatially resolve these galaxies. And then you have empirical models where uh, you just take all the observations that you can get a hold of, and you have a model with many free parameters that can be used to estimate how galaxies evolve in a way that is consistent with all of these observations. And finally, you have simulations that are either large volume, so they have a box in which many galaxies evolve at a fixed resolution, versus zoom simulations that have a small number of galaxies but are probed in exquisite resolution. The nice thing about simulations is that we have complete control over physical prescriptions for different processes, like how we implement feedback or active galactic nuclei or mergers. And we have a lot of control over the setup of how we run the simulation, which is very different from observations that we do of the real universe. The goal in the scenario, as I stated at the very start, is to identify the relative contributions of the different physical processes in how they influence the growth of galaxies. But there are two challenges in using simulations to directly do this. The first is that the fact that simulations have finite resolution. In terms of the large scale hydrodynamical simulation, for example, they have discrete star particles because you cannot go below a certain scale. This can introduce artifacts in the analysis that we do. Second challenge is that because different physics acts at different timescales, and changing the prescription for any one process changes how all the timescales present because of the interplay between the different processes. It's really interesting to think about what's the best representation of our universe from all the possible physics prescriptions that people put in to simulate universes in these different models. So that being said, let me show you how things look in Fourier space. The four sets of plots here show you the star formation histories on the left and the PSDs corresponding to these star formation histories on the right for four different simulations. Simba, Eagle, and Illustris TNG are large cosmological hydrodynamical simulations, and the Santa Cruz SAM is a semi-analytical model. That's what SAM stands for. So what the plots show on the left are the star formation history in bins of stellar mass. So you take all the galaxies that fall within a mass bin, and you find their median star formation history and you plot it along with the variance. On the right, we do the same procedure but for the PSTs. So we take each individual galaxy star formation history, find its PST, then we take all the galaxies that fall within a mass bin and we find the median PST of all of those galaxies and plot it on the right. So the one thing you might notice is that while the star formation history plots look quite similar in overall trends, everything rises and falls, and the rising and falling grows sharper with increasing stellar mass. The features in PSD space in terms of what the overall power is, what the trends are with stellar mass, and what the overall slope is all quite different. And so these differences between the PSDs of the four simulations are a result of, to some extent, resolution, and to a larger extent, the physical prescriptions for evolving galaxies that are put into these simulations. We did a lot of validation to figure out how much resolution might affect things. And we show as dotted lines the parts of the PSD space that are hard to trust because of resolution issues. So basically all the colored points are robust to our resolution effects, whereas the dotted parts might be affected by resolution. If we pick any one of these and we just look at that in more detail, we can now look at how things evolve with stellar mass. So for these three plots on the bottom, I'm showing on the x-axis the strength of the power spectral density, so which is the y-axis over here, versus the slope of the power spectral density, which shows you how correlated or uncorrelated the star formation rate fluctuations are on that time scale compared to time scales beside it. So the three different plots here show you three different slices of these PSDs as a function of increasing stellar mass. So as the size of the dots increases, we are going up in stellar mass. And this basically says that on short time scales, the strength of the PSD decreases with stellar mass, but they grow more correlated. And on long time scales, the behavior flips, and now the strength of the PSD increases with stellar mass along with the slope. So looking at this, it might be tempting to say, okay, so now we have a sort of understanding of how the PSD looks and how things evolve with stellar mass. So now let's go into this and figure out why the PSD looks in a certain way, and then try to understand based on that how galaxies evolve. So this is great. Like it's a very promising idea. But the problem is this is for a single simulation. And before we proceed further, we first need to check whether all the simulations tell you the same thing. So if we try to do that, if we add all the other simulations into the space, we find that no, they don't in fact tell you the same thing. And different simulations predict a wide range of behaviors in this PSD strength versus slope space. And this is because the space is not been explored for the simulation so far, and therefore because of a lack of both observational constraints and inter-simulation comparison in this PSD space, we actually haven't noticed how much the different physical prescriptions that we put into the simulations can cause differences in how stars form within these simulations. So this is a sort of quantitative measure of the diversity between all the different simulations in terms of uh, how star formation stochasticity varies as a function of time scale and as a function of stellar masses. So looking at this plot, it's clear that this is a really interesting space because the space is sensitive to the physics that we put in the simulations, and because observational constraints in this space will give us key insights into the processes that are responsible for driving or regulating star formation within galaxies. Right? So future work in this direction for me and for whoever's interested is to go forth and look for observational constraints in this PSD space. And this is already something that's starting to happen. So NC Wang and Simon Lilly, as well as Sandro Takela and Nevin Chapla, have put out papers that use the PSD formulation to quantify star formation rate burstiness in galaxies on different timescales, and they're trying to get observational constraints in the space. We can also do a few other interesting things with the simulations. For example, we can look at how the dark matter accretion histories of galaxies look like, and we can try to figure out what their trends in PSD space corresponding to these accretion histories looks like. And the first thing we notice is that across most timescales, the PhDs exhibit a very self-similar structure, which means that they don't really change as we change the halo mass, or in this case, the stellar mass of the galaxies. And the second thing is we can now cross correlate. So this is for the Illustris TNG simulation. We did a cross correlation analysis of the in situ star formation histories, which is the star formation rate for stars that were formed in the galaxy and not accreted via mergers. So we did a cross correlation between the in situ star formation histories and the dark matter accretion history. And one of the things we find is that the correlation between, or the coherence between these two time series is low for most time scales, except on really long time scales above 3 gigayears and so on. And so this tells us that the halo accretion drives how galaxies grow, but only on these really long time scales. Another thing we can do is look at populations of galaxies. So what I mean by this is that we can split galaxies in a given stellar mass bin into those that are forming stars and those that are currently quiescent. So this split is done using a simple SSFR cut. So we make a cut in a specific star formation rate space, and things above them are classified as star forming and things below them are classified as quiescent. And we look at the average PhDs for both of these, and then we take the difference to figure out if there is excess power in one of these populations and what that power might be coming from. So for this single plot, you notice that for the Illustris simulation for reasonably massive galaxies, the quiescent galaxy population has a lot more variability on almost all time scales. And if you take the difference, then you can figure out that, okay, this is the extra power that must be coming from whatever processes are responsible for quenching galaxies in the simulation at this mass. So by doing this, we can isolate the timescale contribution of processes that are responsible for quenching. And as we saw in the very first plot, most of this power is on long time scales, but there is also some power on short time scales, and this might have interesting clues for what physical processes are responsible for this. So how do we scale up this analysis? The first thing we can do is we can repeat this analysis across many different models. And when we do this, we see that the excess power due to the physical processes that are causing quenching in these different simulations looks quite different in nature across the different models. So in some, there is a strong mass dependence. In others, there's a relatively weaker mass dependence. In some, there's a strong trend with timescale. In others, there isn't. And in some, there is an excess of short timescale power, and in others, there isn't. So uh, understanding this is a lot of fun because now it's giving us insight into the relative strengths of the different processes that could be responsible for causing quenching within galaxies. If we look at illusters versus illusters TNG, the TNG, which stands for the next generation model, has updated prescriptions for feedback and winds, and it is probable that that's the physical process that's responsible for the process for the short time scale power that we see in whatever's causing quenching. The second hint comes from the fact that there is a split at a stellar mass of about 10 to the 10 and a half solar masses, which is when the black hole feedback really starts dominating how galaxies quench. So we can go into the simulation, and the Lustus TNG model has smaller runs without certain kinds of feedback. So I'm showing here two runs that either don't have any AGN feedback or that doesn't have specifically kinetic feedback from black holes. And you can see that there's a profile for the uh, the excess power that comes from specifically adding feedback of these sorts. And so by correlating the shape of this curve with the shapes that we see here, we can figure out the extent to which this process is responsible for the quenching. Another example is with Mufasa and Simba. In Mufasa, galaxies were quenched mainly by keeping the gas in the halo heated so that it could inform stars. And because this was purely a process that acts on long time scales, there's really no short time scale physical power that comes into the quenching process. In Simba, on the other hand, they have added an updated model for AGN feedback, and so it's now this AGN feedback model that's thought to be responsible for quenching galaxies. So we can do the same thing with Simba, where we look at smaller simulations of the same with the same physics, but with turning off certain kinds of feedback to see what happens to the PhDs. And so at a given stellar mass, you can see that either turning off AGN or turning off specific parts of the AGN feedback model, which is either the X-ray heating or the jet feedback, can cause very different profiles for the timescales. And so we can use these to figure out what the excess in Simba versus Mufasa comes from. Finally, we can uh, also learn more from zoom simulations, which have exquisite resolution, but for a very small number of galaxies. So we are trading statistical samples of galaxies for the benefit of being able to analyze individual galaxies down to much shorter timescales. In all the plots that I have been showing so far, the timescales go from slightly under the age of the universe to about 200 million years on for the shortest timescales we probe. And in this curve, in this curve for the zoom simulations, you can see the same range of timescales with it ending here at 200 million years. But what the increased resolution of the zoom simulations is now allowing us to do is push this down to an order of magnitude shorter timescales to see if the power spectral densities of galaxies still show the same kind of broken power law behavior at these lower timescales, or whether they do something completely different. And this is really interesting to see because it basically ties the whole thing into one unified framework where we can describe galaxies by the strength of their fluctuations on different timescales and analyze the slope and the breaks in the PSD to figure out interesting things about the physics of what's going on in these galaxies. Another interesting thing about analyzing individual galaxies is that you can now see individual bumps and ridges and breaks in these PSDs. That is really interesting to tie back to the fluctuations that we see in these galaxies. So if we just take this gray shaded region and we blow it up, then you can see that all of these galaxies show really interesting trends in terms of how the star formation rates fluctuate versus time. So that's how we probe timescales in the Fourier space using simulations. And before I go into observations, are there any questions about the simulations that I can answer?
Hi, this is Julia.
Hi.
I'm not very clear if you if you estimate this star formation history from the simulation, or if you get that from the model that was used to create the simulation and then passed to the Fourier space.
So the star formation histories come from the simulation. So the simulations
from the simulation.
Yeah. So the simulations are allowed to run, and we take, for the hydrodynamical models, for example, we take all the star particles, and there is information about when they were formed. So if you take all the star particles, order them by the formation time, and then bin them to create star formation rate versus time, you get one star formation history.
Okay, thanks.
No problem. Any other questions? Okay. So in that case, now let's go to how we can talk about timescales from the observations. So observations are measurements of the real universe. This is great because now whatever we measure in terms of timescales can be directly tied to physics that's acting in our world. The disadvantage of doing this is you cannot perturb our universe to see what changes. And so it's this is where we need the simulations to actually tie all of these interlinked timescales to physical observables that we might be able to probe. There are many different probes acting across a wide range of wavelengths that allow us to talk about the star formation rates, stellar masses, ages, metallicities, how the galaxies look, what kind of locality they live in, how much gas they have, what's happening in their centers, and so on. And there's many different techniques to go from what we see for these galaxies to these individual measures of their state. But the one I'm going to be focusing on is something called spectral energy distribution, or SED fitting, which is a set of techniques to extract the physical properties of galaxies from their spectral energy distributions, which is their integrated light. So it's a measure of the flux density of these galaxies as a function of wavelength. The goal is the same as before, which is that we want to identify the relative contributions of various physical processes to galaxy growth and quiescence. But the challenges here are now different. The first challenge is that things like noise or limited wavelength coverage or degeneracies between how different parameters present in terms of the observations can be huge limiting factors. So one of the parameter degeneracies that's often talked about is a degeneracy between the age, dust, and metallicity. And the way all these three factors are thought to affect the SED are extremely hard to disentangle, especially when you have noisy observations. And so this can be a limiting factor in the predictive power, or how much information we can get out of the observations. The second challenge is similar to our challenge for simulations, in the sense that when we have observations, we are seeing the simultaneous or the integrated effects of multiple mechanisms acting over multiple timescales. So how do we disentangle this? And I'll be talking about the first challenge in terms of the SED fitting method. And I'll be talking about the second challenge in terms of what observable we try to estimate from the SED. So instead of looking at integrated quantities like stellar mass or instantaneous quantities like star formation rate, we recognize that these things are probing parts of the underlying quantity, which is the star formation history, and we try to measure that in as close to the way we do it in simulations as possible. So how do we get star formation history information from observations? For the longest time, in trying to estimate stellar masses and star formation rates from galaxy SEDs, people assumed simple parametric forms for the star formation history. So they assume that, oh, okay, so the star formation history probably looks like an exponentially declining curve. And if we measure its parameters, then we can, with these three numbers, completely specify the shape of this curve. So that's a parametric form. For a constant star formation history, you only need two numbers, the overall normalization and the time at which star formation started. And for something like the delayed tau or linear rise followed by exponential decline model, you need three numbers, which tells you the time at which star formation started, the rate at which the exponential decline happens, and the overall normalization of the curve. So basically, by estimating these three numbers instead of the full star formation rate versus time curve, they were able to get constraints on what the star formation histories should be, and therefore on what the stellar mass and star formation rate and other derived quantities should be. The uh, disadvantage of doing this, attractive as it sounds, is that these simple shapes often miss out on the complexity that we see with real star formation histories that we get from local observations, where we can resolve individual stellar populations, or they don't even get the complexity of star formation histories that we see in simulations. So while these models might have worked back in times when signal to noise was poor and we had limited wavelength coverage, as our observations grow to get better and better, we need models that can extract more information than this from our observations. And so with that in mind, we start looking at non-parametric star formation histories. So non-parametric star formation histories are models of star formation histories that don't assume any specific parametric form for the star formation history. So they can take whatever shape they want, and this shape is determined purely from the data. And there's many different ways of implementing non-parametric star formation histories. One of the most popular of which is to just divide time into bins and then find the star formation rate in each bin, which lets you get a coarse estimate of what the star formation history looks like. Another way is to take star formation histories from simulations or semi-analytic models and use that as a basis to do your SED fitting with. And there's a third class of methods, which is what I'm going to be talking about. So this is something that I spent a lot of time during my PhD thesis developing, and it's called the dense spaces star formation history reconstruction method. So it's a kind of SED fitting that focuses on how we can best recover star formation history information from the observations. And the three pillars on which this is built is that the basis of star formation histories that are used to do the fitting must be physically motivated. They should try to encode as much information as possible in as small a number of parameters as possible, so that you don't have to estimate too many parameters from observations that might potentially be noisy or degenerate or low signal to noise. And finally, there should be a correspondence between how well you do when you fit for observations in a CD space versus how well the star formation histories are actually reconstructed. And this third point is key because it becomes the basis for all the validation tests we do, where we try to, at every point of building this method, figure out if the star formation histories that we are recovering are actually a good representation of star formation histories as they are. And to do this, we ground truth these methods using simulations. So we take simulations, we make mock observations for different simulations, we fit all of them to see if the star formation histories are recovered well or not. So satisfying all of these three conditions allows us to create a framework in which we can talk about non-parametric star formation history reconstruction. So version 1 of this was a try where we just considered multiple parametric forms. So we took all the parametric forms that we could think of and we combined them when the statistics allowed it. So when the signal to noise was good enough, combine multiple parametric forms. And this was great, but it was not something that we could scale up to large data sets. So it was not future proof. And so we spent some time and we came up with a more comprehensive way of talking about star formation histories, and using a machine learning technique called Gaussian processes to sort of take this description of a star formation history and bring it to life. What I mean by this is that we can describe a star formation history using a tuple given by its stellar mass, its star formation rate at the time of observation, and a set of parameters Tx, where any Tx is the look back time when the galaxy formed that fraction of its total mass. So this means that T25 is when it formed 25% or 1/4 of its total mass. So if you integrate the star formation history from the Big Bang up until the time of observations, the area under the curve is 1/4 of the total area. You can then talk about any other Tx that you want. So T50 would be when it formed 50% or half of its total mass. And so this is a commonly used thing called half mass time that's found in other papers. And similarly, T75 is when it formed 75% of its stellar mass or 3/4 of its total mass. And so you can take these numbers, the stellar mass star formation rate and Tx, and say that because these are all constraints on the overall shape of the star formation history, we can use machine learning techniques or even splines to create smooth star formation histories that satisfy these constraints. So with three parameters, if I use the Gaussian process technique and I feed it in M star, SFR, and these three Tx numbers, this black curve is the curve that it makes in approximation of what the true star formation history should be. And you can see that it's doing really well at describing the overall shape of what the star formation history should be. But then you might say, okay, so it's doing well because you're giving it 5 numbers. What if you have low signal to noise observations and you can only give it 1 number? So even with just 1 number, even if you only give it T50, it does quite well in recovering the overall shape of the star formation history. And this was the demo that I wanted to show, where even with just 3 parameters, you can do quite well in terms of how flexible you are. So if you change the stellar mass, that changes the overall normalization. If you change the specific star formation rate, which is just an easier way to see that I'm changing the star formation rate with respect to the stellar mass, that's changing what it's doing near the time of observation. And if I change the T50, then that's changing whether it formed all of its stars way back in the past or whether it's forming it much closer to the time of observation. So even with just 3 parameters, it has a lot of flexibility in the kind of star formation history shape that we get. And so with 2 parameters, things get better. With 3 parameters, they start looking really good. And as you increase the number of parameters, the models become better and better at describing the true star formation histories. And as number of parameters goes to infinity, it converges on the true curve. So this is really great because now we can start fitting the SEDs of galaxies. So this is what the observations look like, and using them to reconstruct the star formation histories of individual galaxies, and then trying to do the same kind of timescale estimation that we have been doing so far. So the nice thing here is that we use something called the Bayesian information criterion, or BIC, to find the optimal number of star formation history Tx parameters that that we can get from any given observation. So for each SED, we find the number of star formation history parameters by having a term that accounts for the increased number of degrees of freedom when we increase the parameters, as well as a penalty term for adding new parameters to find what's optimal. So this makes this sort of star formation history reconstruction future proof, because now you can estimate as much information as an SED has to offer. So to summarize, we can start describing the star formation histories with tuples and convert these tuples into smooth curves using Gaussian processes, and then keep the number of parameters flexible so that the shape of the star formation history is completely informed by the data that we're fitting. While there is a dense basis code, it can also be incorporated into any SED fitting code. And so if you're interested in using this, the routines are public, and there's documentation that allows you to set up and start using these codes. It is also available as an option for star formation histories within the bagpipes code, which is another public SED fitting code, if you'd rather prefer using that. Okay, so doing this allows us to create many different, so it allows us to fit massive data sets and figure out how star formation histories evolve as a function of stellar mass or as a function of redshift. And so looking at the star formation histories of galaxies from the Candle survey, you can see how growing from young, less massive galaxies to older massive galaxies, the average shape of the star formation histories goes from being rising to slowly being quenched over time. And we can start estimating the timescales for these for each population at a given redshift and stellar mass. We can also obtain more robust estimates of quantities that are derived from the star formation history by more accurately estimating the underlying star formation history. So if you look at the dense basis, it does better at the bias and scatter of recovering physical properties compared to other parametric forms. It can also help us resolve tensions between observations and simulations. So in the stellar mass star formation rate plane, there's been a tension between intermediate redshift measurements of the correlation in SFRM star space that that seems to be getting resolved when you use these star formation histories. And we can quantify modeling uncertainties because all of these SED fitting codes make assumptions about things like the IMF and the dust law and other things. We can quantify the uncertainty by comparing many different codes, and this is ongoing work by Camila Pacifici, in which the dense basis code is also participating. For teasers of a few other timescales, because I'm close to time, we can do things like quantifying the number of major episodes of star formation in a galaxy's past, where we look at the fraction of galaxies that show multiple peaks or multiple strong episodes of star formation in their reconstructed star formation histories. And we can then get the timescale between the peaks. So the timescale on which galaxies seem to quench and rejuvenate. And looking at these as a function of the fraction of the age of the universe, we see that it's reasonably flat as a function of stellar mass and the fraction of time it takes. So comparing this to simulations is an interesting constraint to see if they can reproduce it. We can also take galaxies not as individual points, but as tracks in stellar mass star formation rate space, and take this thing that's normally a two-dimensional diagram and extend it into 3 dimensions to see how galaxies evolve on the SFRM star correlation and how much time they spend on the correlation as opposed to fluctuating around it. We can also estimate the timescales on which morphological transformations happen in galaxies by looking at the star formation histories of galaxies in different morphological classifications at the same mass and redshift. And we can look at the effect of environment to see that for, again, galaxies at the same mass and redshift, how does the star formation history profile change as you change its locality? So whether it's in a relatively dense versus a field environment. And so all of this allows us to get a fuller picture of star formation histories and how the timescales involved in them correlate with the processes that we otherwise measure through environment or morphology to quantify how galaxies grow. But with upcoming surveys and surveys like SDSS for manga that allow us to get resolved observations, we can extend this one step further and see what's happening within galaxies. So in addition to stellar mass and star formation rate surface density plots that you can get from SAD fitting of, for example, this galaxy, you can also extend it to get a profile of the T50, for example. So the age of or the half mass time for every part of this galaxy, and see how the bulge is much older, and then quantify the time scales on which the bulge versus the bar versus the disk are forming. And one of my students, Caleb Lammers, is working on extending this using neural networks to be able to fit large data sets because fitting individual spaxels can otherwise be time consuming. So look out for that work. So to summarize, the timescales of physical processes allow us to get a fuller picture of how galaxies evolve. Studying these four statistical ensembles of galaxies allows us to understand the physical processes responsible in different simulations. And reconstructing smooth non-parametric star formation histories from observations allows us to then get observational constraints that we can use in conjunction with the simulation to test our theories. So thank you so much, and thank you for bearing with me as I went 5 minutes over time. If there are any questions, I will be really happy to take them.
Thank you very much, Kartheik. Yeah, now we open the floor for questions, so please.
Yeah, I have just one more question. First of all, thanks for the very great talk. I'll probably get in touch soon after
Absolutely.
looking to the code. I'll probably try to run that myself. What are the SED models that you use to do the template fitting? Do you use the traditional Bruswell and Charlotte models?
So my older code was built using the BCO3 models, but currently it's using the FSPS, the Flexible Stellar Population Synthesis models by Charlie Conroy. And within that, you have access to, I think, multiple libraries of stellar tracks as well as isochrones. So you can, for example, if you want to match things to be as close to BCO3 as possible, within FSPS, you can set it to use like the Basel and Padova stellar tracks and isochrones, which is close to what BCO3 uses. But
Yeah.
the advantage is that you also have things like miles and mist, which allow, which include contributions from rotating stars, or BPAS, which includes contributions from binaries. So if you're interested in using those, all of those are available within FSPS.
Great, thank you.
No problem. I'll be happy to answer any questions when you try out the package. And if anyone has questions at a later date, please feel free to email me. I'll be happy to respond.
So are there any more questions? So I guess I'll go then. So what would you say would be like the most limiting challenges of going from of the simulation itself, going from simulation to the data?
So, I mean, in terms of working with the simulations, there's a whole bunch of different things to keep in mind. One is the fact that the physical prescriptions across all of these simulations for doing things like stellar winds or AGN feedback can be very different, and a lot of them have to use subgrid recipes uh, for essentially figuring out what's going to happen on scales either in time or in space that they can't resolve yet, and disentangling the numerical factors from the physical recipes. When we figure out, like, okay, I see this bump in this time scale, is this coming because of a numerical factor, or is it coming because of uh, just like something in the way the hydrocode was written, uh, can be like one of the challenges while working with them. So we had to do a lot of validation to figure out what time scale we can trust given the resolution of a simulation.
I see. Thanks.
No problem. Thank you for that question, actually, because that's something that we spent like the first 6 months of the project just trying to figure out.
Right. Yeah. No. It's one of the things that are it's extremely important with simulations, right? It's knowing where the limitations are as well.
Right.
Okay. Any more questions? So if there are no more questions, I think we can wrap it up. Next week, we'll have Pitar Zesevich from SV Group talking about using AXS for large-scale astronomical analysis. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and a special thanks for Kartheik for a great webinar.
Thank you so much for having me. This was really fun.
Thank you.
Have a good
See you
day and
next
stay
week.
safe. Yeah.
You too.